In 2002, Master of the Flying Guillotine got a theatrical re-release. I went to see it, and then I talked my wife into going the next night without me because I thought it was just that good. Don't be confused. When I say good, I don't mean like Lawrence of Arabia good, or Star Wars good, or Citizen Kane good. It is a decidedly bad film. It is badly made. On the other hand, it's exhilarating, and it raised so many questions for me. This was pretty early in my engagement with Chinese culture and Chinese cinema, so little did I know that everything I was going to need to know I could learn from Master of the Flying Guillotine.
Everything I needed to know I learned from Master of the Flying Guillotine! Soundtrack!
It's jarring in the film's opening moments when the kung fu is interrupted by punk guitar, but the whole soundtrack is actually ripped from two great krautrock masterpieces.
Neu 2,
By-
Neu,
And
Autobahn,
by
Kraftwerk.
Tarantino referenced this in Kill Bill Volume 1, but here it is wall-to-wall krautrock, from the slowed-down march of the master himself to the tinkly tunnel music in the finale.
Plot!
The movie's plot is pretty simple. A blind assassin who wields a head-chopping hat finds out that his students have been killed by a one-armed man, so he goes out to literally kill every one-armed man that he meets.
I don't care who he was. I intend to kill every one-armed man that I come across here.
The film was originally called One-Armed Boxer vs. Flying Guillotine because it was a sequel, kind of, to an earlier film called One-Armed Boxer, also starring Jimmy Wang Yu. One-Armed Boxer established the genre of tournament films, and in '72, Lolier broke kung fu into the US market with a tournament film called Five Fingers of Death. A bunch of quirky fighters are introduced, leading up to a major tournament where they spar. This trope was repeated in massive international hits like Enter the Dragon, The Karate Kid, Bloodsport, and much worse films. Master of the Flying Guillotine, though, subverts that idea because the tournament actually only comes halfway through the film. It's really just there to establish the cast of bad guys. The hero and villain watch the entire thing from the sidelines. I mean, imagine if the climax of Rocky was Rocky and Apollo watching the fight on TV. So, speaking of the hero,
Cast!
Jimmy Wang Yu looks a little long on the tooth here, and that's because he was. He had been, back in 1966, one of the stars of Tiger Boy, a now-lost Shaw Brothers flick, also starring Lolier. This was Chong Che's indie film that was supposed to prove that realistic action and not wire-fu and magic, what we commonly now call wuxia, was the future. Raw punches, raw kicks. Wang Yu went on with Che to do the excellent One-Armed Swordsman 1 and One-Armed Swordsman 2, and then One-Armed Swordsman vs. Zaitoichi. I mean, there got to be a joke that he only made good movies when he had one arm. By '75, he was slumming it, making Ozploitation's only great kung fu film, The Man from Hong Kong. And Master of the Flying Guillotine definitely has that Taiwanese indie aroma to it. Stank.
Cinema history!
I have this poster for Master of the Flying Guillotine, which I bought in Hong Kong, and it awkwardly papers over the original title of the film with a declaration that this is the film that Bruce Lee would have loved. It's a little tacky. But the mid-'70s was a weird time for Chinese cinema because its first megastar, Bruce Lee, had suddenly died with only a handful of hits under his belt, clearing the way for the talented and hardworking Jackie Chan and the rise of Golden Harvest as a studio. In that gap, you saw the rise of Gordon Liu and Kara Hui, and this scrappy attempt by Wang Yu to regain his late 60s dominance. His confidence in his role as a leading man here, despite, frankly, his looks, his acting ability, or his martial arts skills, really rests on that history.
Kung Fu history!
The least interesting fight in the tournament actually stars two kung fu legends. Philip Kwok would go on to be the leading man in the Venom's Mob films, and his sparring partner is none other than Lau Kar-wing, a great action movie director in his own right, and the brother of the action director Lau Kar-wong. If you want to see him in action, check out Legendary Weapons of China, where he and his brother fight for about 15 solid minutes. It's spectacular. The Lau brothers learned kung fu from their father, who, in his turn, was a student of Lam Sai-wing. Lam was the magnificent butcher, played by equally renowned action choreographer Sammo Hung, and Lam is usually portrayed as the comic relief buddy in movies about his own teacher, Wong Fei-hung. Wong Fei-hung was the subject of over 100 films, and the fight between Philip Kwok and Lau Kar-wing here is just a throwaway in this movie. All that pedigree for a few seconds. The fight on poles is also a throwaway reference to Fong Sai-yuk, another Cantonese folk hero, but more on that another time.
Sequel? Sequels!
As I mentioned before, this is a direct sequel to One-Armed Boxer, and it even includes a few brief clips from the earlier film.
You'll need another arm.
It's also an unofficial sequel to the much classier Flying Guillotine, a Shaw Brothers flick from 1974, which has two official and really terrible sequels from 1978. This, though, was a mashup, a King Kong vs. Godzilla kind of movie.
Racism!
Master of the Flying Guillotine is super duper racist. A lot of 70s kung fu is super racist, and honestly, a lot of current movies by Hong Kong, mainland China, the United States, just about every country in the world is super racist. The bad guys and some of the tournament fighters are little more than caricatures. There's an untrustworthy Japanese guy, there's a dirty Thai, there's a mysterious Indian, an ox-strong Mongolian. When I first saw this the first time in the long, long ago, I was surprised that the Master of the Flying Guillotine himself, who is the representative for a totalitarian oppressive government, has this very inclusive way of gathering up his henchmen.
Bounty hunters. We don't need that scum. Yes, sir.
It's wacky for a guy with swastikas on his outfit. So...
Religious iconography!
First, the swastika existed a long time before it was co-opted by white supremacists. And it doesn't carry the same cultural baggage in East Asia as it does for us here in the West. For Buddhists, it's the wheel of life, or a symbol of Buddha's footprints. But as for that international team of assassins assembled by the totalitarian government,
diversity!
Several times in its august history, China was conquered by minority groups. The Jurgens, the Mongolians, the Manchurians. These eras pop up in history books as a really tough time to be Han Chinese. Although, let's be honest, nobody really goes into how much fun it was to be a minority during a Han rule era. There were downsides to these periods. In Kung Fu films, usually you'll see the Ming Han loyalists fighting against the Manchurian Qing, or the Han Song loyalists resisting the Jurgen Jin. But there was kind of an upside. The minority governments tended to be more cosmopolitan since they were trying to normalize having non-Han types around, especially in seats of power. What does this have to do with Master of the Flying Guillotine? Well, as mentioned before, it's a sequel to the Shaw Brothers' Flying Guillotines, a film that is decidedly set in the Qing dynasty. You see those embroidered uniforms and the silly hats? Flying Guillotines has a laser focus on the ethnic struggle between the Manchurian Qing, represented by the Empire and its head-chopping assassin force, and the downtrodden majority Han people. In Flying Guillotines 2, and even more so in the 2012 remake by Andy Lau, and is there any movie that Andy Lau has not remade? It's made even more explicit that the hero's decision to abandon his career, his government, and his friends is all because he discovers that he is ethnically Han. So despite being gleefully ahistorical, Master of the Flying Guillotine showcases the willingness of the Empire to collaborate with just about anybody who can help out, even if they're Thai, Indian, or even Japanese.
Superpowers!
Nice jumping.
This film is rare among Kung Fu flicks in that it takes the time to explain Qinggong.
The control of breath so as to lighten your weight.
Later, Qinggong allows the hero to escape the yoga guru and ultimately defeat the Master of the Flying Guillotine himself. Lightness Kung Fu, as it's sometimes called, is made possible by Qigong, the intentional maneuvering of one's inner energy, or Qi. In the real world, this is an important part of Chinese medicine. In the movies, it's what allows heroes to fly and do other improbable things, like battle for 20 minutes with an axe lodged in your chest like you see here. If you watch enough Kung Fu, you'll see this feat repeated by, for example, the General Ma Xingyi in Blood Brothers with Ti Lung, or by the General Ma Xingyi portrayed by Lo Lieh in Oath of Death, or by the General Ma Xingyi portrayed by Jet Li in 2007's The Warlords, or by David Chiang in the really amazing movie Revenge, or Chin Quan Tai in the pretty good Man of Iron.
Conclusion!
If Eventually, the master of the Flying Guillotine himself is dispatched in a very Sergio Leone-like way, and it stands as another reminder of how Italian, American, and Japanese films were feeding off each other, and a weird reminder that Chinese films were part of this conversation and are often left out of that discussion. When I saw this movie in the theater in 2002, I remember the lights coming up, and a lot of the people were laughing. Well, maybe not a lot, there were maybe only 30 of us in the cinema, but I felt like I'd seen something very sincere, and maybe absurd, but very sincere. And the folks who were there to see 70s kitsch had not seen the same movie as me. So there you have it, Master of the Flying Guillotine. A masterclass in history, cinema, Chinese medicine, religion, Cantonese folk heroes, German music, and about how you can learn from even the goofiest schlock if you take the time to listen.